I'm going to be talking about the Part D, the product service ID in detail. And when we talk about the product service ID, we are talking about the NDC code. So that is one thing that can be a little bit confusing. And the main thing that we want to make sure that people understand is that because of that different nomenclature, with the PDE, you actually have to request each variable separately. So if you need the NDC code, you want to make sure that you're requesting the product service ID. It might be easy to miss. You might assume that, oh, of course, I'm getting prescription drug data. Of course, the NDC code is just going to show up. But you need to make sure that you're looking for the name product service ID. So product service ID, national drug code, the same thing. When we're talking about NDC information in the PDE file, you're looking at the product service ID. It is the NDC code in NDC 11 format. That's something else that's important to note. Not all sources of NDC information are located in NDC 11 format. And so it's important to know that if you are trying to link to outside data sources, you may need to make some adjustments. The way NDC 11 works is that there are 3 segments to each NDC code. I should say NDC codes in general, this is how they work, that there's a labeler code, which is going to be 4 or 5 digits. It's not necessarily the manufacturer, it's the one who's labeling the drug. And then we have a product code that could be either 3 or 4 digits, and that would be assigned by the labeler. So unfortunately, you can't just say, well, if I know the product code, I can find all of this type of drug. Different labelers will use different product codes for the same drug. And then there's a packaging code, which will be either 2 or 1 digit assigned by the labeler. Now you can see that there's some variation in the number of digits here. So there's always 10 digits of information. So if there were 4 in the labeler field, then you would expect to find 4 for the product code and 2 for the packaging code, for example. But so it's not always the same format, however. There could be 442 or 532 or 541. But when Medicare uses NDC 11, it will always be 542. So this was developed by the National Council on Prescription Drug Program in response to the HIPAA legislation. So this is a standard that often billers will use, but it's not necessarily the standard that you will find on NDC directories, for example. So what does this look like? If we're looking at Altase, which is an ACE inhibitor, NDC codes are very specific to not only the drug, but the dosage and the packaging. So when we have this, we have all the same labeler. So these are all coming from the same labeler. So your product will be possibly different, even from the same labeler. These are all Altase, but in this case, we have 1.25 milligram capsule. And then in the second row, we have 2.5 milligram capsules. And because they're different dosages, they're different products. But we also have variation in packaging. Maybe it comes in a 100 capsule bottle or a 500 capsule bottle. In that case, that information gets conveyed by the packaging code. If you were looking at an NDC 10 code, it might look like this. When you need to transition to NDC 11, that means you need a leading 0 somewhere. Now we know here the product is only 3 digits, and we know with NDC 11, it's always 542. And so we need a leading 0 in front of our product code. So that's what the NDC 11 would look like there. Then we also have information on the brand name and generic name associated with each product service ID. When the brand name and the generic name are the same, that generally indicates that it's just a generic. So the brand name is never empty. But you will see, if it's prednisone, the brand name is prednisone. There's also a variable that tells you whether or not it's a brand or a generic. And this comes from First Data Bank. So that's a proprietary software or database that CCW licenses in order to get this information to put onto the files for researchers. And then the product, they also add information on the strength, the dosage form, and then there's a text description of the dosage form. So, TA is tablet or HQ is a disposable syringe. So for each product service ID, because they contain so much information, we get information on the strength and the type of dosage. And then there's, like I mentioned, there's a brand and generic code switch that will tell you whether or not this was a brand name drug or a generic drug. And in 2021, 86.5% are generic and 12.9% are brand. And then we do have some that are reported as a missing value. This is, again, one of those things with administrative data. You do your best with combining data sources, but sometimes, there will be a few that we don't get information on. It's less than 1%, but we just don't have that information on there. So when we think about trying to use the product service ID and the associated variables, so we have, the brand name, generic name. When we're thinking about this, if we were doing maybe a study of the Part D program, maybe we want to say, oh, we've got all this information. What are the top 10 drugs paid for by the Medicare Part D? Or we could do something where we have a cohort and we want to know, what types of drugs are they using? Maybe we want to see how the drugs are influencing their outcomes. So we could define our cohort with Medicare Part A, B, or C. We can say we want everyone with hypertension. Might be tricky. And then use our cohort to study their utilization. Or maybe we say we're going to say we're looking for people that are taking a particular drug. I'm looking for people that are taking specific drugs for prostate cancer that would indicate to me that they've have a metastases that's resistant to other treatments. So these are different ways that we could use the product service ID. So when we think about the first example, we have NDC, we have brand name, we have generic name. Which one should we use, do you think, to rank the drugs? I'll pop actually a little poll up just to see what you think. I'm making you choose one, and maybe you don't know, but I think there are pros and cons to each possibilities. All right, so we have a lot of people saying, well, let's use product service ID because they're going to, be very specific to the type, the formulation, all of that. Some people said brand name. Maybe they're very interested in, what are the top overall brand names that are being billed. And if it's generic, then that will show up in the brand name. And some people said generic name. You can imagine that maybe if you're looking for a drug overall, if you're looking for a type of drug overall, generic name would include, multiple different brands, perhaps of the same type of drug, and then you'd be bundling them together if that's how you were searching. So this is what we would get if we were looking at the top NDC codes. And you can see that one of the limitations of this approach is that, of course, you're going to be getting, there are two different formulations of Lipitor that show up as second and third. We also have, different drugs that we might consider to be in the same class. So it's the same kind of drug, but we can't really group them together using product service ID or brand name or generic name, as was alluded to earlier. But so we do have the limitation with product service ID that you are going to, if you're just running frequencies on product service ID, you're not necessarily going to be combining things that you might feel like should be combined. When we look at generic names, you can see that we already have a difference. For product service ID, Fosamax was the number one. But now if we look by a generic name, we have levothyroxine, thyroid medication, that's number one. because perhaps by product service ID, there are multiple different types. There's multiple different doses that someone might take. So they wouldn't show up on the top 10 by product service ID, but it shows up if we're just looking by generic name. We have some similarities that show up on both, but different order. So we have to kind of figure out. And if we were looking by brand name now, that thyroid medication is down to number 5, but we have lisinopril at number 1. And again, you will see furosemide was number 3 as a generic. It's also number 2 as a brand because furosemide, if it's a generic name, it will show up in the brand name field. I see a question, is generic name have the same product ID? And so it is possible for one generic name to have multiple product IDs, again, because there's different dosages. So they're not equivalent. So that's why you would get different answers if you were searching by product ID or generic name. And so this does get to be a quandary. We have to decide if we're looking for groups of medication, how are we going to group them? And we'll be looking in the exercise a little bit about whether generic names are unified or not. And then combination medications is also an interesting thing. How do they show up in our study? And then so the question is generic best or is brand name best? Do you guys have an opinion? Generic tends to group more like things together, I would say. But there might be reasons to look by brand name as well. So, and yeah, there are limitations to each for sure. All right. So what if you wanted to find drug utilization for a cohort that you've already defined? You have a population with hepatitis C, and you want to know, are they taking drugs to treat that? Or you have a cohort and you just want to know, on average, how many drugs are they taking? When we look at the specific drug question, maybe we have beneficiaries with hypertension. We want to look for prescriptions to treat their hypertension. It's going to be tricky to come up with that list, right? If you were trying to search, you have an idea in your head of all the antihypertensives you want to look at. But if you're trying to type in by generic name, if you're searching by generic name, you're going to need to make sure they're spelled correctly or have a very judicious use of wildcards as you're searching. And these are truncated, so something to note, if you have hydrochlorothiazide, you may drop a final letter. So you want to be very careful if you're searching in the text fields. The alternative might be to look for all the product service IDs. Again, if you're looking for every possible product service ID for any possible hypertensive, that could be very tedious. If you've already defined your cohort and you know that you've got all the drug events for that cohort, you could use an empirical approach. You could say, well, I'm going to do a frequency of the drugs that they're taking, and I'm going to label them antihypertensive or not. That is something that might be done. We also have the problem of, what if we wanted to say, like, what was the average number of different medications taken by these people in my study? Now we're back to that original thing that we did where we were saying, do we want just to know what different types of brands are they taking? We could search by generic name, again, product service ID. And again, the post-acute stays that are covered by Part A, you're not going to find the Part D events for. It's just a note on that. But we have limitations to the information that's on the file. And my point is not to say that this is insurmountable, but it is to say, it's having come from the claim side, you might be a little naive, as maybe I was when I first looked at, I thought, on the claim side, I just look for all the procedure codes that I want. It's, sometimes it can be even a lot, but it's not, it's, maybe 25. With product service ID, the number could be much, much higher. And you can't really search for a range of product service IDs based on the way that they are designed. And so you just have to think ahead, plan ahead about how you might want to do this. If you're looking at just the number of different drugs someone took in a time period, maybe you could use Benny ID and product service ID or brand name or generic name. Now, it was brought up before, there are uh, there are databases that give you information about therapeutic class of drugs. So you could say, I'm really interested in beta blockers. I want to find all the NDC codes associated with, or that are beta blockers. And there are databases that you can certainly do that. The information is not available on the Part D file. You might have pharmacist colleagues that have access to that information. Your organization might have access to that information. You will see this in studies. They'll say, I studied a certain therapeutic class of drugs. You could say if you've got, if you got your whole list of product service IDs, you could say I've, studied every type of a certain type of drug. And we'll talk a little bit more about other ways to identify therapeutic class in a minute. The other example, so what if we want to identify drugs or select a cohort based on drug utilization? So I want to find everyone who's taking a very specific brand, a very expensive drug. You might actually be able to get away with, looking in an NDC database. There might only be 4 if it's a very specific kind of drug. And then you could just make your list of product service IDs and just go with that and just do all the checks that you need to do to make sure, usually there's the face validity. Does this seem about the right number? I didn't make a typo where I'm missing something. Do a frequency of all the ones you found to make sure that they all match what you thought you were searching for. Because it is, it can be difficult to make sure that you've got everything that you want. The other thing to note, though, if you said, I'm designing a study, I want to request data for everyone that's taking levothyroxine. So I'm just going to send that to CCW and they can put that in and pop out my cohort. They actually will not do a search on generic name or brand name because, for the reasons that we talked about, they don't want to, not have every possible spelling, every possible combination of that drug with another ingredient. It would be very tricky for them to make sure that they're getting everything that you need. And so if you really want to select a cohort based on drugs, you do need product service IDs for that. So in that case, you're probably going to want to find a database that you can search by therapeutic class, perhaps. Unless, again, if it's a very specific, expensive drug, sometimes you can just go to a directory and find there's only 4 NDC codes associated with Sovaldi for hepatitis C. Then you can, maybe feel confident that you're finding what you need. So you might go to the National Drug Code Directory. That's the FDA maintains that. They will not give you NDC 11 though, so just make sure. But so you can go to their website, type in the drug that you're interested in. They'll give you the list of drugs. You can export it, and you just want to be mindful of the type of NDC code that you're getting. There's RX norm, which is maintained by the National Library of Medicine. That's a normalization for standardizing drug names. And so that's a possible place that you might go. There's RX class as well that can class it. I will say, it's, if you want to do these studies, it's probably worth figuring out. It is complex when you're first looking at it to figure out exactly what you need to do with those. There are proprietary or commercial databases that they do cost money for a license. I mentioned that CCW uses First Data Bank. I've seen Metaspan used before, or Multum. Are there other things that people want to say that they've used that they've really found useful? Please feel free to type that in the chat if you want to help out with people. And then for drugs that have multiple therapeutic indications, therapeutic class doesn't necessarily solve all of your problems. You might not necessarily know that, methotrexate could be used for arthritis or it could be used for cancer. Just knowing the therapeutic class doesn't help you necessarily know why the patient is taking it. So, or alpha blockers that might also be used to treat benign prostatic hypertrophy.